Why won't my key turn? I asked the question twice before the door opened from the inside. Margaret stood there. My husband had been dead for less than 24 hours, and his mother was standing in my doorway like I was the stranger. Behind her were cardboard boxes stacked beside the stairs. Grocery bags covered my kitchen counter. The framed wedding photograph Daniel and I had kept on the entry table was gone. Then Eric stepped into view holding a new set of keys. What did you do? Margaret folded her arms. We changed the locks this morning. For a second, I genuinely thought grief had made me misunderstand her. I had just spent hours at the funeral home choosing flowers for Daniel, choosing which photograph would sit beside his casket, signing forms with hands that still felt numb from holding the bag of personal belongings the hospital had given me. Now I had come home in those same clothes and couldn't get through my own front door. Why? Margaret glanced toward Eric as if the answer should have been obvious. Daniel died without a will. I looked past her and saw 3 bags beside the garage. My bags, my clothes were inside them. What does that have to do with changing my locks? Margaret's expression hardened. Because this was Daniel's house, and Daniel's property belongs with his family now. I'm his wife. She gave a short laugh. You're just a wife without a will. This house belongs to family now. Eric raised one hand. Betty, don't make this ugly. Everybody's grieving. I looked at him, then at the bags they had dragged out of my bedroom. They had locked me out of my home the day after my husband died, and somehow I was the one being warned not to behave badly. I should have screamed. Instead, I looked through the doorway toward the kitchen. 2 mornings earlier, Daniel had been sitting at that counter drinking coffee while I complained that he had finished the last clean mug. Now Margaret was opening my cabinets. I looked back at her. Who told you Daniel owned this house? Her face changed for half a second. Then she laughed. Daniel was my son. Everybody knows this was his house. Eric nodded. He paid bills from his account. Our attorney can sort out the technical details later. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't checked. They had simply decided. I'm Betty Lawson. I was 34 when my husband Daniel died unexpectedly at 38, and until that afternoon, I thought losing him would be the worst thing his family could put me through. I was wrong. Margaret stepped farther into the hallway and pointed toward the garage. We've put most of your things out there. You can arrange a time to collect the rest. You moved my belongings? We're organizing Daniel's estate. Eric lifted his phone. That was when I noticed the camera pointed toward me. He was recording. Maybe he expected me to shove past Margaret. Maybe he wanted footage of the grieving widow causing a scene, so I took out my own phone. Margaret frowned. What are you doing? I photographed the new lock, then the bags, then the boxes inside, then Margaret standing in my doorway. Eric lowered his phone slightly. Betty, I took another picture. Margaret's voice sharpened. You need to leave. I looked directly at her. All right, she blinked. Apparently, surrender was the reaction she had been waiting for. You can get a hotel tonight, she said. We'll contact you after we speak with the attorney. I nodded. Then I smiled. Not because Daniel had left me some secret will, not because I knew of some dramatic letter hidden in a safe. I smiled because Margaret had just moved herself into a house whose paperwork she had apparently never bothered to read. I turned away before either of them could ask what was funny. When I reached my car, I locked the doors, opened my phone, and signed into the secure cloud folder where I kept our important property records. There it was, the document I had not needed to look at in years. I stared at the file name, then back at Margaret through the windshield as she carried another one of her boxes into my kitchen. And one question settled into my mind. How far were Daniel's mother and brother willing to go before somebody finally told them whose name was actually on that deed? Margaret started texting me before I even reached Rachel's house. The first message came while I was stopped at a red light. You may return tomorrow between 10 and 11 to collect clothing. The second came less than a minute later. Do not remove Daniel's property. Then a third. His watch, laptop, photographs, and furniture stay until the estate is settled. I read the messages twice. Rachel was waiting at her front door when I pulled into her driveway. The second I stepped inside, she looked at my face and said, "What happened?" I handed her my phone. She read the messages, then looked up slowly. She locked you out. She and Eric changed the locks the day after Daniel died? I nodded. Rachel's jaw tightened. And now she's giving you a 1-hour appointment to retrieve your own clothes. That's what she thinks she's doing. Rachel stared at me. You're being very calm. I don't have the energy to be anything else. That was the problem Margaret had always misunderstood about me. She thought silence meant agreement. For years, she had introduced me in ways that made my place in Daniel's life sound temporary. This is Betty. Daniel married her a few years ago. Never my daughter-in-law. Never family. Once, at Christmas, she had actually told a cousin, Betty married into the family. She's still learning how we do things. Daniel had heard her. Later, in the car, he had said, I should have stopped her. I had told him, it's fine. It wasn't fine. I just hated forcing Daniel to choose sides every time his mother decided to test where I stood. Daniel pushed back privately, but he hated open warfare with Margaret. So I tolerated more than I should have. Now he was gone, and Margaret had interpreted years of restraint as weakness. The next morning, I arrived at the house at exactly 10. Margaret opened the door before I knocked. You have until 11. I walked past her. She followed me upstairs. When I reached the bedroom, I stopped. Her suitcase was open on my side of the room. Her clothes were hanging in the closet. Daniel's shirts had been taken off their hangers and divided into piles on the bed. One pile had a sticky note with Eric's name. Another had the name of one of Daniel's cousins. I stared at them. What is this? Margaret barely looked up. Family is deciding what they want. He has been dead for 2 days. They're his things. They're our things. Margaret exhaled like I was being difficult. Betty, Daniel is gone. You need to accept that certain things belong to his family now. I walked over to the bed and picked up one of Daniel's blue shirts. He had worn it on our last anniversary. Margaret reached for it. That one might go to Eric. I pulled it back. No. Her eyebrows rose. No, no one touches anything else. Excuse me. I turned toward her. Do not move another item. Do not give away another piece of clothing. Do not remove anything from this house. Margaret's face hardened. You are in no position to give orders here. If you refuse to leave when your hour is over, I'll call the police. I looked at her. Then call them. That stopped her. Not for long, but long enough. I took my phone out and walked downstairs. Outside, I called Lena Morris. She answered on the third ring. Betty, Lena, I need help. I told her everything. The changed locks, the bags outside, Margaret moving in, Eric recording me, Daniel's belongings being divided up. Lena didn't interrupt until I finished. Then she asked one question. The deed is still recorded exactly the way we handled it 5 years ago. Yes. In your name only, yes. Another pause. Good. I leaned against my car. What should I tell Margaret? Nothing. Nothing? Not yet. Before I could ask why, an engine turned into the driveway. A white van rolled to a stop behind my car. Margaret stepped onto the porch. For the first time that morning, she smiled. What now? I asked. She folded her arms. Maybe someone is here to collect your key. The driver got out carrying a tool case. He looked down at a work order, then directly at me. Miss Lawson? Yes? I'm here about restoring access to your property. Margaret's smile disappeared. What did he just say? Margaret stepped off the porch before I could answer. The locksmith glanced between us. I have a work order for Miss Lawson. You're not changing anything, Margaret snapped. This house is part of my son's estate. I didn't argue. I simply said, I have documentation establishing my lawful access. Margaret pulled out her phone. Within 20 minutes, Eric arrived. By then, 2 neighbors were watching from across the street. Eric slammed his car door. What are you trying to do, Betty? Get access to the house. My brother just died. I know. You're trying to seize his property before we've even buried him. I stared at him. You changed the locks. Margaret raised her voice. We were protecting Daniel's home. That was when I understood what she was doing. She wanted witnesses. So I refused to give her the performance she wanted. I'm not debating property records on the driveway, I said. Your attorney can review them. Margaret laughed. My attorney will. Then she started calling relatives. By lunchtime, my phone was vibrating constantly. One cousin wrote, Daniel isn't even buried yet. Why are you fighting his mother over his house? Another asked me to show some compassion. Margaret had transformed the woman who changed a widow's locks into the victim. But then I learned why she was pushing so hard. Rachel forwarded me a message circulating among Daniel's relatives. Eric and Margaret had already made an inventory for the estate. Daniel's laptop, his watch, financial accounts, vehicles. furniture, and at the top, the house. They weren't merely trying to preserve it. They were planning around money they believed it would produce. Eric had apparently told relatives the property could be sold after probate and that Margaret could use part of the proceeds to buy herself a smaller home. They had divided money that did not exist before anyone had even checked the ownership record. The situation exploded further at a family gathering before Daniel's funeral. I had gone because Daniel deserved to be remembered without turning every room into a property dispute. Margaret had other plans. Several relatives were standing nearby when she said loudly, "Betty needs to understand that marrying Daniel doesn't mean she can erase his actual family." The room quieted. I put down my glass. "Margaret, have you seen the deed?" She stared at me. "I don't need to. You're claiming ownership of a house without seeing the deed." Eric stepped beside her. "Our lawyer will establish everything during probate." "Good," he frowned. "Good, let your attorney check the public record." Margaret studied me. For one moment, I thought she might finally hear the warning. Instead, she smiled. "You're bluffing." I said nothing. "When probate starts," she continued, "you'll surrender the house whether you like it or not." I left without answering. That evening, Rachel sent me photographs a neighbor had taken through the open front doorway while Margaret and Eric were moving furniture. My dining cabinet had been shifted. One corner was visibly cracked. Then Lena called. "There's more," she said. "Eric has apparently been discussing changes to the property insurance. He can't do that. No, he can't." I forwarded every photograph, text message, and screenshot. Lena went quiet while reviewing them. Finally, she said, "Betty, this is no longer just relatives arguing during grief. They're documenting unauthorized conduct for us." Less than an hour later, Lena called again. This time her voice sounded different. The attorney representing Margaret and Eric pulled the property record. I sat upright. "And he called me. What did he say?" Lena paused. His exact words were, "I think my clients have made a very serious mistake." Margaret's attorney apparently expected the property record to end the argument. Margaret refused to let it. The next morning, Lena called me. She says the deed can't be the whole story. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about any of this anymore. What does she think is missing? Something showing Daniel had an ownership interest, another agreement, a later transfer, anything. There wasn't one. But Margaret was so certain her son must have owned the house that evidence contradicting her assumption became, in her mind, evidence that something had been overlooked. Eric started digging through Daniel's financial records. He searched for mortgage payments, purchase documents, transfers, anything connecting Daniel directly to the acquisition of the property. He found payments, just not the kind he needed. Daniel had paid electricity bills, internet, repairs, insurance-related household expenses, sometimes groceries, sometimes contractors, exactly what a husband living in a shared home might reasonably pay. But when Eric followed the actual purchase trail, it led somewhere else. To me, 5 years earlier, I had sold the apartment I owned before marrying Daniel. Most of the money I received from that sale went toward purchasing the house. Daniel knew exactly how the transaction was structured. At the time, he was trying to get his business established, and neither of us knew how much financial risk those first years might bring. So the property I purchased with my pre-existing asset remained in my name. That wasn't a secret between Daniel and me. It was simply something Margaret had never bothered asking about. She had heard Daniel say our house. She had seen him pay household bills, and because he was her son, she had apparently filled in the rest herself. Lena called me again that afternoon. "I'm sending formal notice." What exactly does that mean? It means Margaret and Eric are being instructed to stop exercising control over the property and to preserve everything belonging to you. I looked through the photographs on my phone, my clothes beside the garage, the changed lock, Margaret in my doorway, the damaged cabinet. Send it. That was the moment I stopped merely reacting to what they had done. Every piece of evidence was preserved. Margaret's text telling me when I could enter, the photographs, the locksmith records, the damaged furniture, the messages sent to relatives, even Eric's recording from the first afternoon, especially that recording, because somewhere on it was my question: who told you Daniel owned this house? Once the formal notice arrived, Margaret and Eric began turning on each other. Rachel forwarded me a message from a relative who had spoken with Eric. He says this was Margaret's idea. I shook my head. Hours later, another message arrived. Margaret was telling people Eric had assured her that Daniel dying without a will meant the house would fall into the estate. Their certainty was collapsing into blame, and the relatives who had been sending me lectures about compassion suddenly became very quiet. Lena requested certified copies of the deed and the records tied to the original transaction. When confirmation arrived, she scheduled a meeting with Margaret, Eric, and their attorney. "You don't have to attend," she told me. "I'm attending." On the day of the meeting, I carried the folder connected to the purchase 5 years earlier. Margaret was already seated when Lena and I entered. Eric sat beside her, but there was space between them now. Their attorney had documents spread across the table. Margaret looked at me as if sheer confidence could still change what was written in the county records. Before anyone could begin, she lifted her hand. "Before anyone says anything, I know what my son owned," Lena interrupted her. "No, Mrs. Lawson, that assumption is exactly why we're here." She removed a certified document from her folder. Margaret opened her mouth again. Lena placed the deed flat on the table. Then she turned it around. Margaret looked down at the deed. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then her eyes moved across the page again. "What is this?" Lena remained calm. "The certified deed to the property." "I know what a deed is." "Then look at the owner." Margaret did. Her expression changed. Eric leaned closer and pulled the document toward himself. I watched his eyes search the page. Once, then again. Finally, he looked at me. "Where's Daniel's name?" "It isn't there," Lena said. Margaret immediately shook her head. "That's impossible." "No," Lena replied. "It's quite straightforward. Betty Lawson is the sole recorded owner of the property." Margaret pushed the deed away. "My son lived there. Yes, he paid for things. Yes, he called it his home." "It was his home," I said. "That doesn't mean he owned the property." Margaret stared at me. That distinction was the one she had never bothered to investigate. 5 years earlier, I had owned an apartment that I purchased before Daniel and I married. When I sold it, the proceeds became the primary source of money I used to purchase our house. At the same time, Daniel was building his business. Those early years were uncertain. We had discussed the financial risks together, and we agreed that the property I was purchasing with money from my pre-marriage asset would remain titled solely to me. Daniel knew. I knew. The deed reflected exactly what we had agreed. There was no hidden document, no secret transfer, no later agreement adding Daniel as an owner. Eric tapped the deed, but Daniel contributed to the house. He contributed to our household. I said. Lena nodded. "Paying household expenses does not automatically place someone on a deed." Eric sat back. Margaret looked at me as if I had betrayed her. Daniel would never have hidden something this important from me. Something in me finally hardened. He didn't hide it from his wife. Margaret went silent. "He just didn't report every financial decision in our marriage to his mother." Her face tightened. I had spent days being treated as though my marriage disappeared the moment Daniel died. Now the irony was sitting between us in black ink. Margaret had been obsessed with Daniel dying without a will because she thought I needed a will to protect me. I didn't. Daniel could not leave me a house that already belonged to me. I leaned forward. "You want to know what hurts most?" Margaret looked away. "It isn't that you misunderstood the deed. People misunderstand legal things. You could have called me. You could have called an attorney. You could have checked the public record." Neither she nor Eric answered, but Daniel had been dead for 1 day. My voice nearly broke on his name, but I continued. "One day, Margaret." She looked at me again. "I was choosing flowers for your son's funeral while you were changing the locks on my front door." Her lips parted. "I was grieving too. You don't understand what it's like to lose a son. And you apparently decided that meant you didn't have to understand what it was like for me to lose my husband." Eric shifted in his chair. "Betty, nobody was trying to." I turned toward him. "You carried my belongings outside." He stopped. "You recorded me because you thought I would lose control. You were already discussing selling the house. You were calculating what Margaret could buy with the proceeds." His eyes dropped. You didn't even check whether you owned it." Silence. That was the part neither of them could explain away. They had been so certain that being Daniel's blood relatives gave them more authority than his wife, that they acted first and investigated later. Now there were consequences. Margaret had to remove everything she had moved into my home. Neither she nor Eric had authority to dispose of another item. The cost created by the unauthorized lock change and the damage caused while they moved my belongings and furniture were documented. The cracked dining cabinet was included. So were the locksmith expenses. I refused to let everything disappear beneath the phrase, "we were grieving." Grief explained pain. It did not make someone else's front door yours. The social reversal happened more slowly. Relatives who had been quick to message me started learning what the records actually showed. A cousin who had told me I should be ashamed called. "I owe you an apology." "Yes," I said. There was a pause. "I believed Margaret. I know. She made it sound like you were trying to take Daniel's house. And you decided that sounded reasonable enough to condemn me before asking me what happened." Another silence. "I'm sorry, Betty. I accepted apologies when they sounded sincere. But accepting them did not mean pretending I have forgotten how quickly some people had decided a widow was disposable." Eric's recording became especially humiliating for him. He had apparently filmed that first confrontation expecting it to prove I was unreasonable. Instead, it preserved my calm voice asking the question none of them had thought to answer. "Who told you Daniel owned this house?" The answer, of course, was nobody. They had told themselves. A few days after the meeting, Margaret returned to collect her belongings. I stood inside the doorway. She carried the same boxes I had seen stacked beside my staircase the afternoon she locked me out. The reversal was almost painfully exact. Then she had stood inside while I held a useless key. Now she was the one walking out. I didn't smile. I didn't repeat her words about real family. I didn't need to. As Eric carried another box toward his car, Margaret stopped in front of me. "Would Daniel really want you treating his mother this way?" There it was. Even after everything, she reached for guilt. I looked at her. "Do you think Daniel would have wanted his mother to lock his wife out of her own home the day after he died?" Margaret said nothing. "I will never tell you that you can't grieve your son," I continued. "You're his mother. Nothing changes that." Her eyes filled, but I didn't move. "But being Daniel's mother does not give you control over me." She looked down. I stepped aside so she could carry the final box through the door. That was the boundary, not revenge. Not pretending Daniel never had a family before me. Just the end of Margaret deciding that her relationship with him automatically outranked mine. In the weeks afterward, I slowly put the house back together. Daniel's photographs returned to their places. Our wedding picture went back onto the entry table. I had the dining cabinet repaired. And I changed the locks again. This time, nobody changed them for me. Nobody handed me permission to enter. I chose the locks. I chose the keys. I chose who received one. I didn't immediately sell the house, and I didn't make some dramatic promise to live there forever. Daniel had died. That was still the real loss beneath everything else. Winning control of my home did not make me stop missing him. Some mornings, I still reached toward his side of the bed before remembering. Sometimes I stood in the kitchen and could almost hear him asking where I had put his coffee mug. But now I could grieve without someone trying to turn my grief into an eviction notice. I also understood something about myself that I should have learned years earlier. My silence had protected peace with Margaret for a long time. But peace without boundaries had taught her the wrong lesson. She thought because I rarely fought her, I couldn't. She thought because I didn't announce what I owned nothing. Most of all, she thought Daniel's death erased my place in the life we had built. It didn't. Months later, I stood in the kitchen one evening after putting away the dishes. The house was quiet. Daniel's photograph was back where it belonged. Before going upstairs, I walked to the front door. I turned the new lock. Click. For a moment, I remembered Margaret standing on the other side of that same doorway telling me, "This house belongs to family now." She had been right about one thing. It did belong to family. She had simply forgotten that Betty was the family whose name was on the deed.